Hello. So this is my first time doing this, so excuse me if the presentation is a bit off. I'm more concerned with the audio than the video here, and uh, this is about the logic of God. So it's essentially to answer the question about, does God exist? And it's getting to be it's getting to that level of, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? But we know now that the egg came first, because lizards were there before, reptiles were there before the birds were. So the egg came before the chicken. That's settled. um, then does God exist? And I'm not going to vouch for any religion or any text. As you'll see, like, I fundamentally believe the word of God is a vocalization. Um, and uh, I'm not vouching for any institution, anything like this. It's just more to reflect on where did this notion come from and what does it represent. So, and using logic, it's not about morality or, not so much like a moral question about good and evil and what's going on in the world. Um, it's more that, like, given given our nature, then where did this word come from, and what's the reality behind it? So I'll start. Um, the question, does God exist? Like, at a very base level, we know that God exists as a word. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a thing. So then it's like, well, what does that word represent? And the meaning behind God, it comes from an old root, meaning invocation, that something is vocalized. You invoke something, um, drawing on something and then turning it into a vocal message. That's what the word means. So we're not talking about a man in the sky and all the imagery that's kind of come with that. Behind all that imagery is something else, and it's spoken. Um, so we do that. We invoke the word of God, and I'm arguing that in that moment, in that experiential thing where you invoke the word of God, you're invoking invocation, and that in a nutshell is the logic of God. Now, that's that's where the word and the meaning are married together. You're invoking. In an invocation comes invocation. And that's the kind of logic. That's the kind of logic behind a kind of self-evident truth. So to show how that logic then is a part of the tradition, I'm going to refer to the Abrahamic tradition. That's the tradition I'm most familiar with. I myself was with the Christian community at one stage, and it it didn't transform my life. So then I was kind of led to looking at Islam, and I ended up converting to Islam. So in Christianity, there's aspects of the Old Testament that's looked at. So in the Old Testament, in Genesis, the very first, at the very beginning, God says, "Let there be light," and in Hebrew, that's light exist, and light exists. So therein is uh, the first kind of utterance um, and it's a marriage of speech with an action. That God speaks and it happens is the idea. Um, so this uh, is there in the creation of the first kind of binary, in a sense, that there's light and dark. So if you can imagine what kind of a universe must it have been before light. We can talk about this scientifically, or just in a in our own kind of reasoning. Scientifically, what they're saying is that there was some kind of a primordial diffusion of something between an energy and matter going on, like subatomic particles, or a, a diffusion, absolute diffusion of things. So in one sense, there was like nothing, but there was one thing as well at the same time. Um, and of course, scientists look at dark matter, dark energy these days, which is kind of on the limits of our understanding of what's going on in the wider universe. So we know what we know, but what's intriguing is that these ideas have also been carried through our traditions and are at the core of the Abrahamic faith and other faiths in different manifestations. So I totally accept that. I'm kind of speaking from my own personal experience um, to show this understanding. I can only speak from my personal experience, my personal understanding. So at one stage, I'm trying to widen that and broaden that, but I am limited in terms of capacity to understand. And that, again, is a part of the very issue we're talking about. Um, so, again, another iteration of the logic is that when Moses is lost in the wilderness, and he's looking for guidance for him and the people. Um, there appears a burning bush which he's drawn to, and a voice emanates from the bush that says, "I am that I am, Yahweh." It reveals itself as the voice reveals its identity as Yahweh. I am that I am, and in a way, that's kind of like a circular thing. That's a kind of personal expression of it is what it is. But again, this is at the heart of the logic of God. In one way, it seems very simple, but the implications of it then, I'm going to argue, are evident in a lot of kind of philosophical conversations, and philosophical assertions. And it's there ultimately in our biology, technology, um, and our kind of spiritual material world. I think it's the logic really behind any kind of apparent binary would be ultimate kind of my ultimate view on this. Um, what but it's up to me to substantiate that. And so I'm going to a certain extent, but I will come back to this central logic of that the word is present with the meaning. It's there with the action. It's there with the noun. That there's a marriage of word and meaning. So in the New Testament, then John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word and God. So you have a separation of Word and God there, but a linking as well. And so God is like the kind of sign, and then this notion of word is the kind of reality behind that word. Um, and so what's in the original Greek is the word for word is logos, which is a kind of broader idea about what logic entails. Um, Etymologically, logic means speech. It's related again to vocal, to speech, the power of speech. But it also extends to discourse. So, like a reasonable argument, a dialogue. Um, so, on that level, we're couched in the vocal, the speech. So, on 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 that kind of level of just pure speech, then dialogue has been important from the aspect of early philosophical works that people would write in terms of dialogue to expand upon an idea and do it through reasonable argumentation. Um, so it's there in a sense of like striving for reasoning, have logical discourse, and also reason. The broader idea of reason relating to God is um, that, you know, people saying, why is that there? God made it. Um, why did that happen? God made it happen. On a very superficial level, God is attached to the reason behind everything. So again, an unseen thing behind, an unseen force behind everything. These are simple kind of concepts, but what it then extends into is, I think, quite a kind of fundamental thing. And it's there in, like I say, in philosophy, that we can reason things through dialogue. And that can be an internal dialogue, it could be the voice of reason, um, or else it could be dialogue with another person. But that kind of involves sincere dialogue, or an intention there to approach an understanding, to be kind of not so self-interested in that dialogue. Um, and our dialogue does get kind of compromised and compounded by our self-interest, especially considering in public environments. But it depends on our relationships at the end of the day. We can we're inevitably drawn into being more sincere to the people we're closest to. But in a society of strangers, then this dialogue gets compromised by the very format in which it appears. And this is intensely so in the world of social media and kind of teleological, projected conversations. But at the root there is this logic connected to God, this logos idea. And the extent to which it's extended into philosophy then is recognized as a logocentric tradition within philosophy. Coming into Islam then as well is the notion of the verse that says, all God has to do is say be, and it is. So again, it's all God has to do. In a way, that's like, that's all he has to do, is just say it. But then in another way, it's like, he has to say it. So tying creation with speech, that it emanates from speech. And again, this form of speech, when you consider what speech is compared to our other kind of linguistic output, just on a personal level, we can see that, like, speech as compared to writing, you have the oral and the visual forms of communication. Speech emanates from a body. emanates from directly kind of from a consciousness, and it's active. It's an act. It's composed. It it's couched in our case in an organic, intentional being. Writing obviously is intentional as well, but it's more about drawing. It's as much about drawing meaning from an object as it is from a body. So it's kind of um, materially based. You know, it's almost that dichotomy between the animal and the mineral world. Um, so, um, so just that kind of broad thing of like speech being an unseen thing and emanating, essentially travels in our case through sound, which is the displacement of atoms in the air, and we're kind of stifled by solid material in that way. But we are silent in a vacuum as well. So it depends on a light diffusion of material. Um, and whereas writing can be chiseled into rock, it, like it could be forged out of anything, really. I mean, the harder the material, then the more permanent the writing becomes. So, whereas the thinner the material, to some extent, then the further we can speak, in a sense. Just speaking broadly about the air, you know, there needs to be matter there, but it can't be too dense. Um, so the transformations that happen there are worthy to consider. And the kind of immediacy of speech, and then needing the hearer to be present, and then the performative aspect of that, of speech, just as a human endeavor, is very different to writing. Um, and so uh, this is this leads into then oral culture and written culture, and what history has done in kind of our technical and technological progress. Writing again is inherently connected to a material technology, you know, the pen and the surface, development of paper, for example. All these kind of fundamental things require material technological processes. Speech, on the other hand, is more about the acquisition of knowledge and a kind of mastering of language in both senses of the speech and the writing. But language comes from lingua, which goes back to the tongue. So God is couched in the vocal, has always been seen as an intentional, unseen expression. Like even the word Elohim and Allah have at their roots a sense of lead or leading, which is like pressing forward. So I'm going to come back to this expression, and then as opposed to impression, it's an outward thing. So then, of course, impressions are made in our mind, in our body, in our hearts, and then the kind of response then is another form of expression. So, and that's the response, depending on our responsibility. How responsible are we going to be with our speech? Are we going to consider before we talk? And on what basis then do we consider things? Tying into morality, sensibility, conformity, consideration for the hearer. So the interrelational and interactive aspect of speech it goes on there. Whereas writing is more for the kind of absent-minded, that the reader won't be there. The writer can craft according to the materials, could write, delete, write again, and then publish. But what you say to a hearer, kind of once heard, it's then, depending on the hearer's memory, then is remembered. So there's obviously in the West, we've got a huge kind of outwardly manifest emphasis on material technological advances, as it were. This kind of an ontology and a teleology that, we're looking to the other side of the world and looking at events and then passing judgments on these things without ever having met people or anything like this. And of course, through Western history, then this force, techne comes from the word craft, which also has an element of force to it. So to craft, to change things, but also to force, to materially kind of impose something, is an aspect of technology. And historically, written cultures have overwritten oral cultures, and how it's galvanizing what Noam Chomsky, great linguist, anarchist and linguist, would say is like a kind of manufacturing consent, that you create a message, you circulate it around a certain type of, let's call it a moral economy, that like it becomes news to a certain class of people or a certain type of people, that then manufactures a response, conditions a response, and then gives license for those who are then going to forcefully deal with the situation to go ahead and kind of lends legitimacy to that. So we have a whole people judging another people based on propaganda. And even that consent can be manufactured in the public eye, visually. And we might never know if it's really been manufactured properly in the heart of the public. You've always got this sense of like the silent majority that don't get to speak because they're not sure what to think, or they don't have the platform. So the extent to which written culture has imposed itself on oral cultures throughout history, on the basis of advancement and so-called sophistication, sophistication related to knowledge. But the argument is like the outward manifestation of knowledge in the form of like technology is kind of like an illusion in a way. It's illusory. Like the advances are made by individuals and it's accumulated knowledge, but the accumulated knowledge within oral cultures is much more grounded in like biological inheritance, and then a sociological interaction and a direct interaction. So in oral cultures, then folk tales, and this is a derogatory term actually, or at least it needs to be properly respected. The current term that indigenous peoples in America use now is story work, because it is work, and the idea is that like it's meant to challenge understanding and be a form of knowledge. And so like in New Zealand, it's recognized that these narrations and these traditions from Trader to Tell, these traditions have a scientific basis, because it's all about ways of knowing. And of course, in our kind of overly written culture, then we've denigrated these traditions. Um, we're generally kind of intrigued by them, intrigued by the stories, and so there's an element of that like we do often get a sense of meaning from these, but we're too often reading them as well, because sometimes these oral cultures have just they've been wiped out, and so we have recordings, um, and in that sense, what's missing is us being there to listen to the storyteller and to be responsive and to be part of the story in that sense. So, like considering those dimensions, um, I think some of it involves uh, like a proper respect for oral cultures and the kind of implications and the consequences of our written culture. If you imagine like just how much writing has infused and built up our culture in the West, I'm talking, um, and the Anglophonic West, um, then like I'm not going to talk about China and the what's going on in the East. Those traditions, I don't know. Um, but if you imagine how much writing has kind of constructed our society, like we have our kind of texts, we've inherited political ideas and ideals from philosophers, from their texts, extracting a sense of meaning, building institutions on the basis of these things, the idea of democracy, um, all these different justice. Where do our ideas of justice come from? Um, and then what is really uh, important in this sense is how do those words match with their actions? The legitimacy of an institution depends on how those institutions and the actors within those institutions correspond to a wider public understanding of what those words mean. So again, we have this kind of a rationale, a reasoning, and consider then our administration, bureaucracy built on writing. And you're dealing with strangers, you're dealing with people who don't know you, you're a bit beholden to the system. And there's then a kind of struggle within these different social constructs and these institutions on how best to properly meet the requirements of the public. But we are we are conditioned along the lines of a written culture. So where certification trumps, if that's the basis for our evidence of qualification, um, uh, merits and awards, like these written things, then that's the kind of constitution of where our trust lies. Why we might trust a doctor to perform surgery on us depends on us seeing his qualifications on a wall or his name badge. The writing kind of fills in the gaps between strangers in a sense, and then really lends itself to how much we see a person as being in a position of trust. So this is just a comment, on the the kind of prevalence of writing within our society. So the ultimate kind of concern is that what are we doing to the material world, as in our kind of material pursuits of meaning, of truth, of a, a, a greater sense of knowing. And what did we already know as through our biological inheritance? It's kind of the difference between us creating a telescope that we can launch into space so we can look at the origins of the universe as we know it, or whether we, in contrast, we embrace the fact that where did these kind of ideas about God or other kind of oral traditions, like where did that kind of knowledge come from, in a sense? Because we're using up a lot of material resources in our search for this meaning, in our kind of establishment of our idea of scientific progress. And there's cases there of absolute abuse of people. So I'm not going to go into that now. I could get into that more and more and more, so that we look at that, essentially like this kind of dialectic between the oral cultures and visual cultures. But essentially we've got a dialectic, a relationship between the unseen and the seen. And God is in the realm of the unseen. The kind of force behind the seen world is the fundamental understanding. So it's inherently vocal. So again, like God being the reason behind everything. So let's just say, for me, it's like, even, when people denigrate certain things as that's just a myth, that's just a story. Even talk about biblical stories in the sense of that's just a fairy story. I'm kind of like, well, like fairy stories were told in a certain context and obviously produce certain results. And so again, what we have now is we have books and then we're reading them to our kids or whatever. And they seem kind of trivial, obviously in certain elements fantastical. But that's kind of the point. It's like a kind of an experience. And behind that relationship is then the storyteller to the listener, and how much like we can come off the page and tell that story and make it a dramatic experience. Like we all love our fiction. And that comes back to a root word meaning form. So form. So forget about like, oh, is it real or is it imaginary? Fiction is form. You form a story, you build a story, you tell a narrative, or you form an idea maybe in your mind. But it comes from a place. And like a truly reasonable person will be able to say that, like, this isn't, I mean, made up is one way of saying it. It's made up. Okay. But why was it made up? What's the reason it was made up? And what impact does narrative have that information can't satisfy? Like we have conspiracy theorists because, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but we try and form a narrative, but we can only work with what we've got. And when it comes to the need to maybe have a stake in the political scene, then we will base our we will look to the so-called facts, the things we believe have happened. Facts relates to acts. So actuality is factuality, you know. Acts are facts, fiction is form. Um, there's all reasons behind these things. Um, so, but we generate a narrative, and let's not deny that. Like, look at Netflix, Amazon, our streaming services, our series, our TV series. We get absorbed in fictional narratives. Why? What's the reason behind that? What do we want from those fictional narratives? So when people kind of denigrate biblical tradition as just loads of fairy stories, I'm kind of like, well, at least these stories didn't cost $100 million to make. You have something on paper now, and it can be told. And it's not about like moralizing over who did what to who, because in terms of a real kind of religious person's mind, as I understand it, is our concern is about God, is about the reason, our reasoning of why these things would happen. It's not so much about what did Abraham do to such and such and such. It's more about what did God do to these characters? What's going on behind the text? And that's where the heart of storytelling is. Like our Irish traditions and culture is filled with some brutally violent stories. Um, and so it's that kind of thing. It's like people like Richard Dawkins will think, no, you couldn't base your morality on biblical tradition, because it's appalling, as he'll say, as he had said. And it's kind of like, well, maybe it's supposed to be appalling, that like, it's not like we think, oh, he did that, I'm going to do that too. Because in the Abrahamic faith, you're worshiping God. You're not worshiping the people in the stories. This is how I've come to understand it now. And I understand this because of my interest in storytelling and oral culture, that what happened within people's, within social systems, organically, biologically, how did these things resonate? So another example of like having meaning connected to the thing, the activity or the noun, is that we have cognitive dissonance. And the kind of root thing of cognitive dissonance is where your beliefs don't align with your actions. So that's about personal integrity. Whatever about like debates about should a person be doing this, that, and the other, like we moralize too much over what strangers do. Like what's really important is that the people around them kind of put them on the right path, kind of thing. It's it can be really shocking what kind of people emerge from certain classes of people or groups in society. And then we say, how did this happen, kind of thing. And that runs through every kind of institution, Catholic Church, celebrity status, popular culture, everything, really. Islamic societies, groups. So it's, but the thing about marrying a belief with an action, I think, has been recognized, like diagnosing that as cognitive dissonance, it's then, well, what's the solution? What's the opposite to dissonance? It's resonance. What resonates with people? And what resonaire, sonaire means to sound. Again, it's connected to sound. What is sound? What does it mean to be sound of mind? So this is where I see the logic of God, that we consolidate. There's a kind of absolute consolidation of our expression and our actions. And then in the broader picture, then it will, where it seems reasonable in the minds of others, then it can be become a custom. And what is the root of the word knowledge is custom. It's something we adopt. It's something that we enact. And at the root of it, we can easily get fooled into thinking that I know this and I know that and that, when really knowledge is in being at its heart. It's like that thing of don't judge somebody until you walk a mile in their shoes. Knowledge, if I believe the centrality of knowledge is in being, then you will truly know it. And so there's a kind of idea I've heard in Islam, which is that there's 3 stages of knowledge. That there's hearing about the fire, then there's seeing the fire or discovering the fire, and then there's being the fire is the 3rd stage of knowledge. And so even the thing of discovery, that's the kind of like bringing it into the visible, in a sense. I mean, how do you discover things through speaking, through talk and through speech? How do you just discover things? That's reasoning. You have a conversation. You start to consider what's called the bigger picture. But really, we're too focused on having a worldview, and we've kind of lost the emphasis sociologically when it comes to like prominence in, I think, what's kind of driving politics. Then we're losing the idea of having a world sense as opposed to a worldview. So the other extension of writing in that sense is, of course, the economy. How long has our money been forms of writing? The invention of notes. I promise to pay. I promise to pay. In the UK, the kind of home of modern banking, to take people's mineral wealth or to be entrusted with it, and then to publish notes. If you look at the economy, the published notes are 10 times the value of the coins in circulation. So what's going on there? Like, why are we trusting the notes now? And now, of course, going cashless. I mean, we're cashless if we don't have, just having notes, really. That's not the money in itself. That's just a note to say, I owe you £10. But for some reason, we've gotten to trust this. And then we have like an inflated economy, kind of a virtual economy. So now, of course, going cashless, then it's data. It's essentially data. It's essentially written in binary code. And this is becoming the kind of mode of the so-called economy. When really we can have lots of economies. We can have a moral economy. which is couched in what people believe in and what they're prepared to act on, as opposed to the national economy, which is kind of binding us, in a sense, into a broader system. So the extent of this then as well, if you have an administration in politics and that's wedded to a written economy, then there is your nation state and your national currency. And what other social model are we presented with then, apart from regional administration that stems off of this national currency? Where's the place for culture? Where's the place for art? In the UK, 95% of the land has been appropriated and is in private property. So again, that depends on title deeds, inheritance, forms of government, how many landowners were parliamentarians, what they did through enclosure acts, legislation, publishing legislation, how much a society needs to gather around a certain legislation for it to be enacted, and then in some cases brutally suppressing people. How can we preserve an oral culture, one that's around folk songs? I do Irish folk songs, and I attend sessions with English folk singers, and that's precious, as the Irish saying is that those in power write the history, and those who suffer sing the songs. And there you have that again, that the dialectic between writing and vocal. So this is at the heart of believing in God, and we have been kind of confounded, whether we're religious or not. We have been confounded in our ideas about what God is, because we've been presented with certain images, and those things then are like kind of permanently seem to be etched in our brains. And yet to base your reasoning off visual evidence is one thing. It's like people say, show me the evidence for God. It's like, what? I can't. What do you mean show you? I can tell you. And it's a case of whether this resonates with you or not, whether you see where this is kind of coming from. Because the idea of a kind of absolute consolidation of binaries, that our perception, our two eyes, maybe our two ears, we kind of experience a binary thing that goes on, our two lobes in our brains, and how much of the body is paired, how much we kind of necessarily experience a binary, like a pole, a kind of pole on which we kind of gauge where we sit. It's like a matrix of binary things that we then navigate, and then come to understand where we sit. It's like being a character on a page in a book, and unless we kind of think beyond ourselves and try and, in a visual sense, see beyond ourselves, we won't see the full story, kind of thing. But what does that mean in terms of like a vocal tradition? Then is that we need to talk and engage and just be reasonable and really kind of get to grips with why we believe what we believe, and watch for those things that denigrate verbal tradition, those kind of things that, like, where you see debates and it's like, that's just your opinion. Where it's like, why are we talking if we're going to go to that level? like that really kind of cuts into a conversation. It limits a conversation to say that's just your idea. Like these things come about for a reason, and true kind of discourse and debate, it is there for a reason. It should have a purpose, a trajectory. What is it we are debating? Um, and then it should be conducted in a certain way. And if there's an audience, then it's important that we realize when we're engaging with another speaker that really we're doing it as much for the audience as for ourselves. But also there's the thing of how things change by being looked at, that kind of internal experience of like, I feel like I'm being watched kind of thing. Um, so these kind of dynamics go on in as human reactions. And so this is my attempt to say, like, let's kind of end this debate around, like, does God exist? Because it's really hampering. I'm just surprised it's still continuing, really, to be honest. And you have all these intellectuals and do you believe in God kind of thing? When just think, like, when you think about the words that are being used, does God exist? Like God being invocation, that's the nature of it. It's speech. It's a form of speech. But in that idea, it's like I say, the consolidation of words and meaning and actuality. Then exist. Exist means to kind of stand out, in a sense. And there's even a kind of an active aspect to it. So it's on a par with express. So does God exist? It's like God is existence in that sense. It's not the material, it's the unseen, or it causes things to exist. It brings things from the unseen into the seen. But the whole thing is like there was never nothing, okay? Like the kind of simple binary is there was the heard and the seen. There was the kind of voice and the vision, in a sense. And that speech was there before there was vision. So, biologically, organically, amongst animals, photosensitive pits, um, they came after the body was experiencing waves of pressure, whether that was under the sea or, well, I mean, let's say pure speculation, of course, but let's say there was marine animals feeling the waves, feeling the earth, blind in the dark, so to speak, but then developing something about their bodies, becoming aware of the presence of light. And then this ultimately leading animals to go onto the dry land, and to leave their aquatic existence, that kind of striving for the light kind of thing. But before that, there's the unseen world, and it's coming in waves, coming in waves. And then as we come out into the air, then it's coming through the air. And another element to speech, of course, is that it's organic, it's biological, and it's not just limited to the tongue, in the sense that, like, our actions can speak volumes. Actions speak louder than words, in a sense. So the speech is like an organic intentionality in its kind of perhaps purest form. It emerges as words because it's this thing of, like, it's pointedly about words, it's pointedly about language. But we have body language, And again, where I think where people appreciate things is where people's actions speak for themselves. Um, and I think if we are reasonable, and we acknowledge the power of speech, then we can act in powerful performative ways. Um, so we live in a culture in the Western society that embraces and really puts almost to the foremost freedom of speech. But like freedom of speech began as a parliamentary prerogative in the UK. So it was about having independence from royal decree. So it was within Parliament that people could talk about political matters without being concerned that they'd be done for treason, essentially. So the need for speech amongst the political classes then required that the idea of freedom of speech was recognized. To the rest of the people in the country, it's almost irrelevant. It's like, who's going to govern our speech? Like, who's going to stop me saying what I want to say apart from the people around me? You know? So, but now people are taking the idea of freedom of speech and at a very simple, irrational level, they think free speech means free speech, that freedom comes without responsibility, without like being responsive to others' concerns, without being responsive to the voice of reason. Like, just think twice before we speak. But it's very much this notion that freedom comes without responsibility, which I fundamentally don't agree with. But also, like, we have a political class that'll act like they grant us freedom of speech. And but like if they have selective hearing, then what does that mean? And how much has money, a written form of money, corrupted the legitimacy of politics? Like, if we only get like a 30%, 40% turnout, then there's conversation briefly about the legitimacy of politics, of government. But that, like, you can disengage from the political system, but in England, you try and disengage from the economical system, and you'll be on the fringes. It's like the traveling community here, again, like traditionally couched in oral traditions, storytelling, fusions of language, mobile, not fixed in place. And in Ireland, then this was like the administration just wanted to come and say, where are you, so that I can tax you and I can take account of your property that is to your name. And it's a written logic, you know, that imposed itself on these cultures, and so much because of financial imperatives. And now we're at this stage where it's like we have capitalist realists who say we can't imagine a system outside of this money. But when you consider the illusory nature of this money and how much it's been inflated, you see then there the kind of capacity for crisis. And, you know, credit is a creed. So the word creed relates to credit, and it means to believe. How much do people believe in this? But it's gotten to the stage where it doesn't matter if we actually believe in this. We're kind of compelled to go along with it. And my argument then is, well, how have we let ourselves get to this situation that we don't have the interactions where we could build a community outside of this national currency? In Nigeria, there's something like 500 languages, and people picture lots of just little simple villages just operating in weird, arcane ways. No, listen. Listen to that. 500 languages. That's like sociological groupings that are essentially autonomous. That like they have their language. That's their kind of circle of meaning amongst a society of friends, let's say, but people they can relate to. And they, like, a lot of languages blend in necessarily, but it points to a real independency in a people. Um, and like Nigeria is huge, right? So what they call a village is as big as, like, it could be 200,000 people. That's the language they use when they come here. It's talking about their village. Could be massive. And we come with all our assumptions. English being imposed in Ireland. Part of colonialism was criminalizing the language, and not allowing, because it's a direct impact on collective action, is don't talk. Like, don't talk like that. Part of slavery was mixing up people of different languages so they couldn't collectivize. And these colonial methodologies, founded on this kind of legal framework around private property that itself is couched in laws, Roman laws on slavery. So, like, colonialism depends on written culture and an organization of that, and telling rumors through popular press about what a person has done, what a people have done, why this person has been condemned, and the role of the media. And we see that right now with what's going on in Israel, Gaza, and the kind of the total bias in the popular media, until it gets to the stage where people speak out so strongly that the media really collectively has to acknowledge this. But it's like, this is how kind of history is written then. This stuff, like when it's written down in form, is the stuff that will be read, and is the stuff that will, lead people to think, well, what do people not know? So it's just this comparison between oral culture and written culture. So the idea of God, the logic of God, is there in a vocal tradition, and we call it sometimes tribalism, and we call it mythology, which is what it is. Myths are told stories, but remember, there's means to myth. There's elements of myth that have to be there in order to tell the tale. And like a good storyteller will concentrate on the memes and then deal with the nuance of a story. And then that provokes a kind of a world sense in the ear of the listener. And it's an art, and like something that's passed down necessarily vocally, necessarily verbally, interactive. Yet what we have on the other side of things then is like an education system that is about you reading the books, you going, getting your qualifications, passing those marks. And of course, then the ultimate extent of writing is now artificial intelligence. So data, extraction of data, again, using private property, appropriation of data, then a kind of bundling of all this into language learning models, and then creating machines that can do a lot of, well, creative output wouldn't be quite the right word, but expressive output in terms of writing, in terms of imagery. Um, and so this is challenging our perceptions about knowledge, about consciousness, uh, even about like where we're going as a species. Um, so you know, like I would just want to reconcile. This is all I want to do in this, is to get past that question of does God exist? We should more be asking what's the logic of God, and what does God mean? What does it mean to like what does it mean to have a God? And I understand people. I understand atheists in the sense that I understand why there is absolute skepticism because of what's come institutionally, what's come in history. And but I kind of see it like God made atheists for a reason. And so in Islam, it's like no God but God. So there's that, throughout the Abrahamic faith, it's founded on um, tearing down false idols. And so false ideas of God, yes, but false ideas about um, material forms as well, and trying to imbue them with a consciousness, even trying to imbue them with a consciousness, trying to imbue them with life, and still call it life and still call it consciousness, when really we're not sure if our consciousness is really just the distillation and the activity that's going on between the particles and the processes in our bodies, at that atomic level. We don't know if really what life and consciousness is the interaction between things rather than the thing itself. So, uh, like, there's so much about overcoming ourselves, and Islamic philosophers recognize this. Islamic philosophers recognize Imam al-Ghazali when he wrote about the 99 names of Allah. He says that there's apparent opposites in the names, the subtle, the manifest, these names. So there's a kind of pairing, and there's a recognition even between like male and female, um, about like the necessary relationship between apparent opposites. It's like man and woman are, nearly 100% the same, and yet the differences is almost like what determines our attitudes to each other, and that brings in this sense that there's like opposition where there's so much similarity. um, but there's something there about like it's the difference that takes precedent, that we're more concerned with the difference than the similarities. And maybe it's our attraction, our drawing our attention to the differences. So, but whether that's to increase the sense of difference or to approach a unitary understanding, you know, like, are we looking for unification here? Because that's what God is about. Your God is one. Your God is the Abrahamic thing. Your God is one. Your God is oneness. Your God is unification. Bringing these apparent opposites together in some conceptual form so that you can appreciate the understanding. Um, so, so let's say there's the binary code, for example, in technology, the zeros and the ones. I'm kind of intrigued then with how that relates in terms of gender. Like there's the phallic one, there's the um, the vaginal uh, zero, but really, like um, the broader kind of conceptual binary there is about the unit, um, the unit, uh, kind of like something being particular. But then opposed to that then is holism, holism, having a holistic view. Um, and this kind of binary is there uh, in terms of nothing and oneness. Now, there was never nothing. Uh, Nothing is like the likeness of Allah, is the other thing as well. So nothing is like the likeness of Allah, is the Islamic saying. And again, remember that your God is one. So nothing is like this oneness. And it's kind of like nothing never existed. Logically, nothing never existed. Like nothing doesn't exist. By its very nature, nothing does not exist. So why do we have that word? And then, of course, we've got the word God. And I pointed to the kind of positive assertion of God, invocation of invocation. But the kind of coming to express that word. So it's like the phrase of, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. I'm going to say it, right? Because I don't want this to be molded into any semblance of a human or a persona. It's like a force, an expressive force. But nothing is like the likeness of God. So we invented nothing, so we could relate other things to it. It kind of helps us gauge things in our mind. It's a kind of negation first. Then we have the oneness is like a positing. And again, it's a conceptual thing, a positing of a oneness that goes beyond whatever it is that we see, and those kind of binaries and divides that we feel are happening. The divide is more our individuation. It's as much like in ourselves as it is in the world, kind of thing. So another thing Imam al-Ghazali talked about was that in the process of naming is that there's the self-consciousness and the world consciousness, or let's say the universe consciousness, the microcosm and the macrocosm, and that in the naming of God, you're transcending from one into the other. In the expression, it's from the self into the world, but the word we who invented the word God? We've taken on the word God in that sense. So we live in what's called a worlded language and a language world. Language is like our interface with the wider world. So it's in that context in which God appears, and what does it signify? So yes, God exists as a word, but the reality behind it, it is it appears like a choice, but then, like if I say to you, there's a reason behind everything, and you say, no, there isn't. Well, then who is it that sounds more kind of deluded? Who is it that sounds more reasonable? Or and how are you going to tell me to show you there's a reason behind everything? We'd have to look at the thing itself, and also taking on that our expression is something we've perceived. Like a child listens to words before it utters its first words. We absorb this language world and then we inevitably express it because it's like pressure. You take on these impressions, and we have to express. That's part of being the thinking human, as Linnaeus called us. But we're also feeling humans. We're sentient beings. So this expression is all a part of that. And what makes the idea of God so compelling is that, like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the first word that was uttered by God was light. And on a universal scale, that is the ultimate expression of like a visible projective force. And of course, the opposite to that then is the gravitational absorbent force, which is probably at the heart of nothingness, right? But what happens? You collapse into a wormhole. We get beams of light, singularity. There was a singularity complex. We get beams of light into our eye. You know, it's for the individual, it's very particular. Of course, everybody's seeing the same light, but in our eye, from our perspective, it's a single point. And the opposite of that then is collapsing into a wormhole. This, for me, is the ultimate kind of gender binary. So I can see why God has been made a he in that sense, is deemed masculine. And so there might be a truth to that. It's just that it's lent itself to, you know, in the Judeo-Christian narrative, the creation of Adam was like male and female created he, they. The first man was male and female combined. And there's a biological truth to that. We emerge, for the most part, in binary ways, biological sex. But there's, of course, the biological phenomenon of hermaphrodites that shows that biologically there's transition. But then extending into gender, like gender is a form of becoming. If a woman gives birth to a male child, it's not called a man. It's like that boy will become a man. Like manliness is a becoming, and woman is simply female man. It's wife man is where the word comes from, and wife connecting to female. So it's female man. So they're both men. Why don't we have a word for masculine man, but we have a word for feminine man, or male man and female man? So, and in the word mankind, then there's this thing of, well, it refers really to both sexes. But gender now has become this apparent binary, but we just lose sight that it's a social construct as well. There is a biological reality, but gender is a social construct. But in this sense, then it's kind of like God would be, you know, if we were to choose and see it in terms of sex or gender, then God would logically be male, and then the opposite, almost like the beginning, because in the beginning was God. So there was God and the beginning. So it was never just God. God is a kind of universal transformative aspect to whatever was there in the universe before the likes of the Big Bang, for example. So as you can see, like the idea resonates, literally resonates through much of our known world, our known universe, according to what we already know. So it's quite a simple thing to say, yeah, God exists, and not be afraid of the kind of implications of this. And it's just about honing down into what are we talking about here when we say this. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your consideration. And I hope it's been, I hope it's kind of encouraged things, and encouraged a kind of wider, kind of reasoning, a kind of wider understanding, a desire to know a world that we don't know. We're not encouraged to know because of the powers that be.